Hello, and welcome to episode 37 of TBR, the To Be Read podcast, where we talk about the books we love and the topics that interest us. As always, I'm joined by Michael Ronn and Jamie Maltman, and I am Patrick Stemp. How you guys doing?
Great. How are you, Patrick?
Good. How's your week been?
Pretty good. Pretty
Cold?
good, yeah.
Cold.
Yeah.
Yes, lots of cold.
One way of putting it.
Yeah. So tonight we're going to be talking about what pulls us out of a story. And before we hit that, as always, we're going to go through the books we've been reading over the past week. And we'll start with Jamie.
All right. Well, I continued on the two books that I'd started last week there. So that was the, oh man, I'm going to have to look that first one up. The Whole Earth Discipline, the one that I was talking about. And Stuart Brand is the author. Yeah. I actually haven't made that much progress on it. I read like maybe another part chapter, starting to get into like his arguments on like why urbanization is important to our green future, which goes against what a lot of, go back to the earth and, organic farming kind of stuff. It kind of goes in the opposite direction. So interesting, and I've always found that kind of stuff interesting. And, stuff like 300 million people in China moved from like into cities in the past 50 years. So like the population, almost the population of the U.S. moved into cities in China in the last 50 years, and the same thing will happen in the next 50 years. It's crazy. Like the world will be 80% urban in the next 50 years. So anyway, that was some of the things that just really stuck in my mind from that. I'm about 2/3 of the way through The Assassin's Apprentice now, the first book of the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb, and enjoying that. It's getting into how he gets, not only how he gets trained as an assassin, but how he gets trained in one of their magic systems kind of things. So I've been enjoying that part overall. And then the one I read today, actually I had it out of the library ever since Michael mentioned it like 2-3 months ago, The Art of Styling Sentences by Anne Longknife. I think I requested it that day and got it the next week and then sat on it. And then it had to go back today after being renewed twice. So I sat down and read that this afternoon after I had a meeting earlier today. So I was burned out and didn't feel creative, so I'm like, all right, I'm gonna do some stuff. And actually had some feedback from a reader about one of my books about a particular sort of niggly thing, and that got me thinking, okay, I'm just gonna go and really hit this with this. It'll relate to that particular grammar point that so far no one else had complained about, but it was someone who enjoyed one of my books, but is also an editor like for a living, and so that particular niggly thing might have taken them out of the story a bit. But they specifically said didn't take them out of the story enough to knock it down a star, so that feels good. So yeah, so that's pretty much my week in reading there. A little fiction, a little nonfiction, and some other more nonfiction.
Cool. How about you, Michael?
Yeah, kind of the same for me. I fell ill on Sunday, so I was in bed a lot. So I had the opportunity to finish American Gods, which was pretty cool. I finally finished it after what's been like a month, which is kind of inexcusable for me. I don't ever take that long to read a book, but I finished it, and you guys are right. It definitely did get kind of weird right where I left off, and without spoiling too much, it does get kind of crazy near the end, like blending reality with perception and what you believe and what you don't believe and all the different gods and things like that. But
stuff you would like, right? So
yeah, it was good. I mean, I have to admit, and we could talk about this maybe later in the topic of the show, there were a few things that pulled me out of the story, so I'd be curious to see what you guys think of it. But yeah, I finished that, so that was my fiction for this week. It's a huge book, so it's like 500 pages, so that was the longest book I've read in a while, so that was pretty much most of what I read, but I did work through Claudia Altucher's book, The Idea, How to Become an Idea Machine. Just doing a few more exercises, trying to generate some more ideas. So
when you say work through, you don't mean finished?
No. Well, I read. When did I mention it? Last week or the week before that? Or I'd read like the prefatory stuff. So like maybe the first 20% of the book where she explains her philosophy, and then ever since then I've been doing the daily exercises that she talks about. So I haven't really skipped ahead. So I don't know what's coming, but I thought it was pretty interesting. And then another book that I read was Superstructure by James Scott Bell, and that is an extension of Write Your Novel from the Middle, which I mentioned last week. And basically he just expounds on the theory that he has in Write Your Novel from the Middle, that you should start your book, or when you're starting your story, start from the middle, and then you can move out and then move back, because the middle will tell you what the book is really about. So I didn't like it as much as the first book, but it still got the job done and helped me see things in a different way. So that's pretty much my reading, pretty light.
Okay.
How about you, Patrick?
Well, let's see. I read through the Walking Dead Compendium #2. That kind of sucked up a large part of my weekend because it's such a huge tome. And so if you're a fan of the Walking Dead, the television show, and I've mentioned this before with Compendium 1, and you've never read the comics, I'd highly recommend it. It's a great comic for one thing, but it's also really interesting as a fan of the TV show too, to see what's the same, what's different. And so I'm glad I finished it, because this past week's episode I was very curious to see if what happens next in the comic for these characters is where the TV show is going to go, and it is, which was kind of neat to see. So I'm very curious to see. Now that I've read, I hadn't read past where the television show was, but now that I have, it'll be kind of neat to watch things happen and see if they sort of meet or go against my expectations based on the comic. So that was pretty cool. I finished reading Excommunication, which is the third book in Peter Cline's X series. That's the one about superheroes living in Paramount Studios and trying to protect, normal humans from the zombie apocalypse, basically. And so there's some cool new characters introduced in this book, and some familiar faces, old villains coming back for revenge, and it's as I said before, it's basically a comic book in written form, and it's a lot of fun. And I also read Jareg, which is the first book in the Vlad Taltos series. I actually have the an omnibus of the first 3 books in the series, and so I'll move on to the next 2 shortly. It was a lot of fun, and so Jamie, I know I'd mentioned this one to you before, and I would highly recommend it to you. I'd be curious to see what you think of it. Unfortunately, it's a little hard to find. You can't. You mean your library system may have it. Mine doesn't. The bookstores never have it. I was able to order this through probably Amazon, but it's. I think it would be something that might be right up your alley, and it's the kind of fantasy that I like. It's not horribly epic. It really focuses on the main character Vlad, and he has his circle of friends, his wife, and his the people. So he's an assassin for hire on this very strange. I'm going to have to guess that it does not take place on Earth, but it's a world with these, I think, 17 houses of different houses, and I don't want to talk too much about how that works, because it'll sort of give away elements of the story. But the main character is basically an assassin that's hired to kind of do an impossible job, and he has to find a way to get around sort of the rules of the world and the rules of the purple people that he's interacting with to assassinate this other character. And it was a lot of fun. And I think that's it for my reading for the week. So it was a pretty productive week.
Cool.
And so I guess with that, we will move into our topic. So we're going to be talking about what pulls us out of a story. Any initial thoughts on that? Anybody want to go first?
Did you want to start with your topical American Gods one there, Michael, or?
Yeah, sure. I mean, since it's something all of us have read now, that's like a first, isn't it? Like a book on the show that all 3 of us have read, and
I don't know. Have we all read Altiture's Choose Yourself? Have you read that, Jamie?
No, I've read his blog a ton as he was writing.
Okay.
So I probably know all of it, but yeah,
yeah, you might be right.
Yeah,
I think there's been a couple. I think because Green Star, or we've talked about some
Good
other
Omens.
Green Star.
No, you guys haven't read Good Omens.
I haven't read Good Omens.
No, I will, but not yet.
Yeah. Well, anyway, yeah, it's good stuff. This was my first introduction into Neil Gaiman, and definitely enjoyed it. Like, he's probably on my list of favorites now, just the way that he writes and like his characterizations and all that. I mean, he's right up my alley. So, thanks guys for that recommendation. But there were a couple things with American Gods that just kind of stopped me dead in the water. And the first was, it wasn't so much a problem in the beginning of the book, because I think it took a long time to get going. But near the end of the book, I just felt like I don't know, the world building and the story and really getting inside Shadow's head just got to be a little too much. I don't know if you guys felt that either, but it felt more literary at the end than it did at the beginning. And I don't really have a problem with literary, but I just felt like a whole lot of stuff wasn't happening from the 50% mark to like the 75% mark, without giving any spoilers. But
kind of hit the long middle there, and
super at the longest middle in a book I've ever read in a book, actually. and it didn't help at the end. I felt like I was just waiting for a climax that never really happened. And I don't know if you guys felt that either, but
it's hard for me to speak specifically to that book because it's been years since I read it. But yeah, I can definitely see how kind of getting off topic or getting off the point, you kind of just want to get back to the story. I can see how that, would make it hard to finish.
Yeah. Well, it's because he spent so much time in the beginning of the book laying out who all these gods were, what sides they're on, all this conflict with the old gods versus the new gods, and then kidnapping Shadow and making themselves known, and then it was just like you're at the top of the mountain, and then it's all the way down, and it just never came back. And it's hard to talk about without spoiling, because if our listeners are watching or listening, maybe they haven't read the book, but yeah, that I just was expecting a bigger payoff, and then when it didn't get there, I pulled back a little bit, and maybe that's why I initially put the book down that first time, is because subconsciously that's what was going through my mind. It's like I'm waiting for more action here, and it never really came.
Well, and I think, because again, I guessed roughly where you were when you put it down, and was right, because it's got that stretch, like the town stretch, right, which you can say that being a big spoiler,
basically.
So there's some kind of neat stuff, but it's a very different tone for the most part from the rest of the book.
Yeah.
And it's like you said, like it's a little different. Whereas I don't know, I felt like the payoff and the climax worked for me once they get to all that stuff at the end. But like you're saying, that stuff, that part of it wasn't really building towards that in the same way. It was just
right.
It was just more
right. So funny thing is, I like the ending. I didn't have any problems with the ending. It was just the middle.
50 to 75, I'd say that's about right.
It just didn't deliver for me. And I guess for me, like when I'm reading a book, and I guess I expect a natural structure, and if there's a deviation from that structure, then there better be a good reason for it. Or in this case, I don't think that there was. But overall, it's still an example where I still enjoyed the book, though.
Yep.
And I think your example of so something similar to what you're talking about that can kind of pull me out of book, one of the items I had was flashbacks. And specifically, and we've talked about this before, is sort of some of Stephen King's flashbacks or backstory, where he can kind of go off the rails a little bit and tell a backstory or get into a flashback that just lasts a lot longer than you sometimes feel. I mean, it's very well written and it's always very interesting, but it's not the story that you're reading. So I think that maybe is kind of sort of the same little thing, just because sometimes they can last so long. So flashbacks are okay. And in fact, flashbacks I think are handled very well in the X series that I've been talking about. Those books are kind of mostly told in the now, but occasionally you'll get these chapters that are told in the then, sort of the backstory of some of the heroes and what their lives were like beforehand. But the chapters are fairly short. They don't take over the story, they just inform the story. And versus a flashback that takes you back to somebody's childhood and lasts for 50 pages. So that's something that's...
Or it's a flashback just because it seems like the author thought it should have been there. Like you get 2 or 3 chapters into a book, and then all of a sudden, flashback. It's like, what the hell? It's like there's just no point for it, and then it's always the same thing too.
There's probably a point to it, but I wonder if it'd be kind of like Chekhov's gun, right? Where maybe the author knows that he needs to plant that seed, but can't be bothered going back to the beginning of the book to show that, and instead just like inserts a flashback to create let you know that this character has this ability or this thing that happened to them that's going to let them solve the problem they have now. Is it better to seed that kind of stuff at the beginning, or put it in just before you need it, right? When it seems maybe a little more convenient.
That takes me back to another thing that pulls me out of a story is prologues that start before the book begins. And not all the time, right? Because it's just one of those things. I think all the examples we can give is probably something that, isn't going to apply to every single book we read. But I don't know. It just rubs me the wrong way when I see a prologue. Because it just, 9 times out of 10, they're not interesting. It's like, why should I care? And then they usually have nothing to do with the story until, like you said, Patrick, like halfway through the book when something needs to be solved.
I don't mind prologues, but I'll give you an example of a prologue that I think made me feel cheated, and that was Game of Thrones. I can't remember the name of the first book, but so and of course I've read maybe the first 50 pages of the first book or whatever, but so it's also with the television show, so all the commercials leading up to the show, and then the first episode of the show itself, there's sort of this prologue that shows these ice monsters, there's going to be magic.
Okay, I'm like,
right.
I was trying to remember what the heck the prologue was.
Right, and in fact I think Dan Wells in his 7-point structure thing calls it the Ice Monster prologue, but that here's these awesome, scary demon monster ice things that are really cool, and you don't actually get to see them again.
Here.
Yeah, season 4. They'll be back in season 4 or whatever. Like, that kind of that's a show for sure, and maybe that kind of I felt misled. That there's going to be dragons and magic, and there's none of that. There is, but not enough to satisfy me.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, what about epilogues?
I can live with epilogues as long as they actually have something to do with the story. Mm-hmm. As long as they, I don't know. For me, a good epilogue is when the author basically is saying, okay, well, I'm kind of leaving this open. Maybe I'm going to come back to it. Maybe I'm not. Like with Harry Potter. Have you guys read the Harry Potter series, the last chapter epilogue?
Not yet.
Okay. Well,
no.
never mind. I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to say anything about it then.
But I'm aware of it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's the weirdest epilogue ever. But it's like, well, does she leave it open? Does she tie it up? It's kind of up in the air, And even with American Gods, there's that epilogue in the back. You guys know what I'm talking about. The epilogue where he's talking to the guy. If that's not.
Again, it's been so long.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm blanking on it. So.
Well,
it
with
seems
the epilogue
forgettable,
there,
maybe.
Yeah. The epilogue there, it's like, well, he kind of leaves it open, and Neil Gaiman himself even said that he was considering at some point writing a sequel to American Gods. So, I don't know. I guess for me, it's nice to have everything tied up in the chapters, but I think there's nothing like a good epilogue either. Short, sweet epilogue.
Yeah, and I mean, if we're talking about getting pulled out of a story, I mean, it's a little too late by the time you hit
pretty
the epilogue.
Much.
Right? The epilogue for me, almost like if it's in a movie, is the heroes are gone and the hand pushes its way out of the dirt, Jason's hand or whatever. Yeah, so.
Or Nick Fury appearing and saying, "I need your help," after the credits.
I'll say, you know what? I'm going to call Serenity the best epilogue ever.
Okay.
But you guys haven't watched.
We haven't got there yet, and I will.
You haven't watched Firefly yet, or Serenity?
No, I will get to it.
No.
But I was going to say, like, prologues are a funny thing because, having read so much epic fantasy in my life, it's like almost a staple in a lot of epic fantasy stuff. And it depends on how they're done. Like, I've read really bad ones that were boring, and the odd time I didn't get into a book. And then I have found some other ones, like you were saying, that were just so jarring, where the epilogue was good, but then the tone is just so different in the first chapter that it's.
Do you get a lot of epilogue? I could see the danger in an epic fantasy for an epilogue being, here's 300 pages that's explaining the history of the world.
Those are appendices. Okay. But no, epilogues would be most likely. And I like epilogues as, that story is done, but here's the bridge to the next novel kind of thing. I'm totally fine with that, and that's. And not even as a cliffhanger, but just as a, stuff is a little bit tied up, but now it's sort of, well, it's going somewhere in the future.
Yeah, I
Something
think
like
even
that.
the worst epilogue is still head over, way better than the worst prologue. Because at least with an epilogue, it's like, okay, yeah, he overstayed his welcome. I only wasted 10 pages of my time.
Hmm.
But with a novel, it's like when you start with a prologue and the prologue sucks or it's boring, it's like, well, what's the rest of the novel going to be like?
Right.
I remember one prologue that I read on like for a book that one, The Emperor's Soul by Brandon Sanderson that I read, or sorry, prologue. I think it had a good epilogue too, actually. But the prologue was good. It was pretty short, and it was like time-wise just before the novel happens. But it was that he was using a different character's viewpoint for the only time in the story. So I could understand where that, and it was useful to create the context for the story. But again, it wasn't some way over here thing that was totally different. It was, this is why this character is here, and boom, now they're here, and we're in that character's head the rest of the way.
Yeah, there
So
was actually a prologue in Jareg as well, that book I was talking about earlier, and it was used to give you that backstory of the main character, kind of his childhood, where he came from. But it wasn't overly long, and it was very interesting and very well written, I thought. So it was actually it sucked me into the story to start. It wasn't something, I didn't feel like I was slogging through something to get to the point. I enjoyed it quite a bit, actually. And so let's
the
see. I had a
candy
couple.
parts, prologues.
I had
What
a
are some other
couple.
parts?
I had a couple fairly simple ones, I think. So one of the things that yanks me out of a story is characters, and so character names. And what I'm talking about there really is, um, I'm bad enough with names in real life, and if there's a character in a book that hasn't been in it for a while, maybe this is one of the reasons I have such a hard time
That's
with
a
like
fantasy.
Game of Thrones. Yeah, is I've seen it all the time, and I think I've had this problem with many authors. So they'll have a character that's a bit part in chapter 2, and then they come back in chapter 18 for some reason, and quite often I'll find myself just trying to remember who the heck this person is. Was it their friend? Was it somebody they worked with? I just can't remember for the life of me. And I've found myself in the past going to Wikipedia to look up the plot synopsis or the outline of the book, just so I can see if that character's name is there, and so I could just kind of jog my memory who the heck this person is, so I don't have to flip back through the book to try to figure it out.
Yeah, it is pretty annoying, especially if the character at the bit part they had in the beginning of the book wasn't even interesting.
Yeah.
Right, and now they turn out that they're important for some reason. The
That
other
would bother
thing,
me, I guess.
yeah,
If they were minor enough that it's like I can just go yeah yeah yeah, then I don't care. Like if there is a character list at the back like Game of Thrones, I would flip to jog my memory there. But yeah, if
and that
they're
also, it almost kind of makes you wonder if at the point in the book where this character is being reintroduced as somebody who's maybe important, if the author, when they were writing it, kind of went, oh, I need somebody here, and that little bit where they were introduced in the beginning was something that they just added in to kind of seed that
Right.
character, so that it didn't look like they were just dropping them in out of nowhere.
or you never know what might have been cut from the middle somewhere where they
True.
did appear again and they're gone now because they weren't important enough through the rest of that, because that definitely can
Yeah.
happen. I know the odd time when I've been beta reading something and I've found some of those artifacts that you go, wait, what about that? So
One of the other little ones that can pull me out is words, and specifically words that I don't know. And part of this is just as being such an avid reader. I mean, a lot of the time you can tell through context what the word means, but if there's even a part of me that isn't 100% sure,
has
quite often, I'll go
has
look
this
it up.
helped on the Kindle where you can just touch it and
Yes.
like,
Yes.
that's a game changer for that particular thing.
Yep. I used to keep a physical dictionary beside me at all
Me too.
times, and um, so and and most of the time, when you're reading a book, you might come across a word or two, but there have been books in the past. Science fiction can get a little wordy sometimes, and there were times where I would get pulled out of the story because I found like 2 or 3 words a page. I was looking them up, and then you get to the point where it's just I can't do this anymore.
Yeah, that's a good one. I didn't think about that.
I was going to say, yeah, like I have a pretty good tolerance, but 2 or 3 on a page, I would probably stop the book. Like it would just irritate me because I have a pretty wide vocabulary, over the years. But I'd be like, you're just if they're just showing off, and I don't like that. That throws me out of the story. Like it really does. Like it's silly. Like I tend to simplify a little bit even writing myself because of that. Like I don't want anyone thrown from the story if I can help it.
Right.
You see a lot of that in literary fiction too, where they'll use these big words just to use them. You know, and you see it in poetry too, where I used to read a lot of poetry back in the day, and one thing that would just irritate the heck out of me is when all these poets would just use these names of flowers or some natural thing, you know, as an image, expecting that I would know what the Latin word of this flower would be. And it's like, well, I'm not going to go to the, because you can't look it up in the dictionary, and you can't look up the Latin name of a geranium in the dictionary. You have to actually go on Wikipedia, and you know, I didn't have a smartphone back in those days, so you know, I'm not going to read in front of my computer, you know. So that kind of annoyed me sometimes too.
I think I mentioned that, right? With that book Desiccate that I read, that has since been renamed, so it was a good thing because the name just wasn't a good name for trying to market it. Neither was the cover, but so she did a rebrand. But anyway, there were a lot of, like, every plant and flower she was seeing, she was naming, and you know, some of them are ones you know, and then some are ones that are a little bit less usual, hibiscus and stuff. And I'm like, okay, I know that because I was in French Polynesia. But then it's going on, and there's just so many of those that was throwing me there.
It gets really hard.
That reminds me of Among Others by Joe Walton that I read a few years back. It won the Hugo, if I'm not mistaken, and that was a book that I had a really hard time getting through. It's a very strange story, but it also seems to be one where the author is trying to show just how many great old science fiction and fantasy books she's read or not, I don't know, but at least aware of, almost like a love letter to classic sci-fi and fantasy. But the list of books in that story because the character in that story, basically she can read, like, you know, 8 books a day or whatever, and tells you about every single one of them. And so I found myself pulled out of that story a great deal because some of the stories mentioned I was aware of or had read, and others I found myself, I got to read that. I got to write that one down. Oh, that one sounds interesting,
or,
right?
Or it could so make you think of the ones you liked, right? Like either one could take you out.
Yeah. Sure.
Oh, I should go read that book. It's better than this one.
Exactly. Maybe that one won't pull me out of the story like this one just did.
Right.
Right. What else? I had.
I was going to throw out one.
I'll tell you. Go ahead.
Okay, sorry. It's funny because I think my tolerance for the bulk amount of description has gone down over time, and I like things leaner and a little cleaner now than before. So, you know, if I went back and if I picked up Tolkien today, would some of that give me a problem where there's like the pages of description on things? For like, I haven't. It sometimes gets close on the George R.R. Martin stuff, especially when it was like there's one particular part where I think it's like the first tournament, and it was describing like the heraldic symbols on their, you know, like the coats of arms on everything, and the colors of their banners and the tassels on their horses, and as well as all the names at the same time. It was just a whole ton of stuff like that all at once. So
yeah.
Patrick, are you muted?
Are you there?
Sorry. Yeah, I was muted.
Physical muted.
Were you chanting a spell or something?
I thought he was like, damn that George R.R. Martin. That's way too much description. I can't.
No, I said you almost convinced me to read Game of Thrones if you're talking about there's like Quidditch tournaments in Game of Thrones.
No, I'm saying like jousting, like and
I know.
Tournaments. Yeah, there you go. But that stuff but like some other, you know, so that's something that I'm definitely very aware of. And I know it's funny. I'd never heard of this, but my brother-in-law, when he reads epic fantasy stuff, if he sees a paragraph that's too long without any dialogue in it, he'll read the first sentence, and if it's not interesting, he'll skip it and just keep going. I'm like, really? Like, people, wow.
Skip to the next line of dialogue. Yeah.
Yeah, or like skip to the next paragraph. So he's just like, he knows that's a block of description. He's like, I just don't care. But he's also a very patient person.
So this may be a question for Michael, but because Jamie, I don't know how much of this you do, but when you're listening to audiobooks, because I think you do that more than I don't really do that much. How do you find that it's easier to get pulled out of an audiobook and kind of lose track with real world, if you're listening in your car and, some idiot in front of you's got his blinker on and you don't know if he's really turning, do you find yourself having to kind of rewind? Are you getting pulled out of that stories that way as well?
Not really. I think it's harder to get pulled out of an audiobook because think about it. I mean, even if some guy puts his blinker on and cuts you off, that's only a couple seconds. Right, the book still continues, and you just kind of fill in the blanks with what you've missed. And if you did happen to miss something, you just hit the back button, and you can go back 30 seconds, and you'd probably be okay. I listen to audiobooks pretty quickly, though. I listen to them at like 3 to 4 times speed. So, yeah, I mean, I don't do it as much with fiction, but with nonfiction, I fly through them. But with fiction, I usually do 1.5 because 1.5 usually keeps the speed. It's faster, but it still preserves the performance. But
if you listen to Neil Gaiman, let him do it at his speed.
Yeah, I probably would. But yeah, I mean, yeah, it doesn't bother me as much, I guess, just because I guess your brain kind of fills in the context. So I don't know. For me, I've almost all the audiobooks I've bought, I easily listen to them all the way through. There have been a few exceptions with some super long ones, where maybe I might skip around a little bit, but yeah.
The one fiction audiobook that I did listen to was actually on the Tim Ferriss recommendation was Graveyard Book, narrated by Neil Gaiman's book, narrated by Neil Gaiman.
Really?
It's cool. My wife's actually reading that now, and it's fantastically done. It's great, but because I was doing something funny with it, so it's kind of my fault. But for me, it's just there's certain when I'm doing some of my work, I can listen to fiction for most of that, but then if I had to switch and send an email where I'm composing words, I should have stopped. And a couple of times I'd forget to pause, and then I'd actually have to go back and listen to it again. So it's not the book's fault.
If you're not paying attention, the audiobooks will fly past you. But if you're driving in the car on a commute, I mean, what else are you going to do, right? I mean, it's other than try not to get into an accident.
Yeah. So one of the this might be a stupid one, but I'll tell you, one of the things that constantly pulls me out is the word "it's."
For whatever,
even when it's right, for whatever
your
reason,
brain trying to figure out is it right or not.
There is this little piece of my brain that every time I see that with the word "it's that split second will say that's the right one, okay, and I could go on. I don't know what it is.
The worst part is when they use it incorrectly.
Right.
That's what kills me.
That's like a second longer, and that's just enough to cause.
I think my brain just has a hard time accepting that it's a contraction and not, showing like owner. Yeah, it's just a weird, stupid little thing.
Well, that leads me to the one that I had on my list was typos.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure.
I can tolerate typos. They don't bother me as much as maybe they should, but I guess I don't mind them as much in nonfiction just because I guess you read it for information anyway. But with fiction, I'm a little less tolerable of it, but I can stand it. But when it's just too much, or when it's something like, the difference between here and here, like you hear something or are you physically here, that's just too much. It's just like, come on. I mean, how did your editor miss that, or how did you miss that? And I guess I know that a lot of writers aren't good spellers, but it does take me out of the story.
Well, I've seen books where character names are misspelled.
Mm-hmm. I've seen that too.
And if it happens once, you
right, not the end of the world.
But it does pull you out for sure.
Yeah, and I guess I've become more tolerable of it since I've become an author, because never fails. Every time I publish a book, I go back through it and then I find typos, even though I've had it edited twice by 2 different editors, So I've learned to be a little bit more lenient on that because I know that it's probably going to happen to me at some point.
Well, we've all read traditionally. It's published books that
it's every book out there. Yeah, I mean there's every book out there has some sort of
has
typo.
1 or 2 at least.
Just a matter of whether you catch it.
Volume. I'm totally with you on the volume aspect of that. Where if it's a chapter in an indie book, I'll just chuck it up. I'll still highlight it because I may get in touch with them and try and, I'm like, if I like the book, I'm like, I want to help you get rid of this if I can. Mm-hmm. But if it's multiple per page, then that definitely starts to drag me down and slow me down. So
the ones that bother me are the ones that have actually been edited. where they have
Right.
a high volume of typos.
Yeah.
I've read a couple of books like that, and that just makes me scratch my head a little bit.
So
It
I
makes me
had
disappointed in their editor. Yeah.
Yeah.
so I actually had an email from one of our listeners and author friends of ours, John L. Monk.
Hmm.
And he
Cool.
actually he knew what we were going to be talking about, and he actually threw a couple interesting ones my way. For him, he was saying one thing is the sudden appearance of the writer's politics.
That's a good one.
I'd say probably usually if they differ from yours, right? Like then it's the more jarring. But
Or maybe if
yeah,
they're
It's obvious.
yeah,
yeah, there's story. Animal Farm is interesting and not um, in your face. He's making a point, but he's not tapping you on the shoulder while he
Right.
does it. So I can see that shoulder tapping would get annoying. Um, Another one he had was jumping from one character's point of view to another.
hmm
So I can see that.
I'm definitely more. That's more jarring to me now.
Hmm.
I probably always was. You just didn't see it that often, like where it was done kind of strangely. And again, and if you go back into some of the omniscient ones, that were written a while ago, sometimes it was very much like that, and they were drifting in and out very quickly. But if it's happening, if there's something that seems like it was someone else's perception, those are the worst to me. Is the ones that are on that edge where it didn't have like someone's internal monologue and it wasn't really hugely into their head, but the perception was just enough that it was off. That stuff jars me more, and I think especially since I started writing, it gets to me, and I will.
That's one thing that kind of can make George V. Higgins a little hard to read. Fantastic author. I love his stuff. Some of his books, Rat on Fire. One of his books was recently made into a movie, The Friends of Eddie Coyle. The movie was called, I can't remember now. But anyway, his books are extremely dialogue heavy, and there's not a lot of attribution there. You really, really have to pay attention to what you're reading to follow the conversation,
Mhm.
because there could be 3 or 4 people speaking, and it's basically like you're in the room listening to the conversation, and you really have to pay attention to follow through. And I love those books, but you almost have to learn how to read George V. Higgins. It's interesting.
Related to that, you just reminded me of late attribution. It's not something that any editor, any even like half decent copy editor is going to let through, but like block of text where instead of like a little bit he said, like you're a little bit Joe said, and then continuing with it, where
Right.
someone tries to delay the attribution, that drives me nuts because having to, I'm reading it in the wrong voice or whatever, like that, that stuff really pisses me off. I might put a book down if that happened too much too early on.
You know what pulls me out a little bit too, just occurred to me, is poem or song.
Yeah, that bothers me too. When they
So
get, yeah,
in the middle of, and then all the dwarves broke out into song, and
I like that stuff. No problem. I have no problem.
yeah.
with that.
I always
I don't even
past
read
it.
it. I skip. I
Yeah,
always
I do
skip
too.
that.
Even if the poem looks like it would be good, it just never seems like it mixes.
Like as a kid, the Lonely Mountain, far over the misty mountains, cold to dungeons deep and caverns old. That was one of my favorite poems as a kid. I loved it so much. And then when they made that into the song at the end of the first movie, it's like, oh, so awesome. Got Crowded House singing it. Oh, I love it.
We do have some comments.
Cool.
Oh, awesome.
David Anson is watching. Says hi everyone,
David.
and he also says, in response to what pulls him out of a story, when vampires sparkle in the sun, it just pulls me out every time. The
As
worst
they
one for me
burn,
is,
or no?
well, he keeps
Yeah.
going. He says, the worst one for me is names, off the wall names that no one would ever name their kids. I think science fiction and fantasy are definitely guilty of that.
The name that pulled me out, I'll mention this quickly, sorry.
Yeah.
If you've ever read the Pendergast series of books by Child and... what's the other author's name? I can't... Preston and Child. The main character's name is Aloysius. which is a name that you may hear but maybe have never seen in print. And so I, the first time years ago when I read the first couple books, I thought it was like Aloysius, just based on the way it's spelt, and that's how I was kind of pronouncing that in my head. Another name that I hate is Siobhan.
Oh, we have a
name that's
family of Irish kids. There's harder ones, like how you spell Neve and how you spell Sircha. You have some friends, little girls that are all those names, and there's a lot of letters in those names.
Yeah, another name is Mafanwy.
Anything Gaelic Irish.
Yeah,
you got all sorts of crazy
or
stuff.
Llewellyn or something like that. Yeah.
Or Welsh. That's Welsh. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. There's my awful geography. Okay.
Or
any of the double L's is always Welsh.
And I'm drawing a blank here, but the female lead in Harry Potter,
Hermione.
Hermione, there you go. That's one that if you see that in print, I could see kids especially having a
Hermione.
Yeah, I always thought it was Hermione, and then I saw the movie.
It's not a very awful. Not a very
Well, we do have another comment. And it's by Miss Astro Stone, and she says, "You're Kindle hooked when you touch the paper page of a book for a definition of a word."
Totally.
I've done that. I still do.
Or I have or I'm using my old, I've been doing something on my phone, and then I'm using the old Kindle where I actually have to go in and highlight it using the buttons instead of because it's not.
Some of the features on these digital devices are amazing, but so that makes me think of something else that pulls me out of the story sometimes is when I'm reading a book on the Kindle and it says, touch here to see how many other people have highlighted this piece of text.
That's a good point.
When I didn't highlight it in the first place, so it's an interesting feature, but it does pull you out of the story.
Does that
always do that? Because I remember it doing that before, and then I think I looked at a few, and maybe if you look at enough of them, it's like, okay, you know how to do that now, and now it just shows you a little dotted line, which is easily ignorable.
I get the dotted line. I'm also using. Well, I'm using
different devices.
Yeah, I'm just using like the Paperwhite.
Okay, well, mine's older than that, so.
It doesn't do it when I use the app on my phone or on the tablet, but on the Paperwhite it definitely does.
I'm trying to think. I had some other grammar-y sort of ones that would bother me. Like sometimes if there's changes in tense. Like if some of the tense stuff doesn't agree, like some of the stuff seems present when it should be past, and there's just some wrong usages there. Like it depends on if I've been editing lately. That stuff will really drive me nuts, and again, I'm not going to put it down, but it'll definitely jar me.
I remember this will pull you out of a story for sure, and I'm trying to remember what book it was, but there was a book I got from the library last year, and I know I mentioned it on the show. I think it was that one where the high school kids are all trapped inside the school and they can't get out. It's kind of Lord of the Flies, just in this. Get to the page where, so you get to one page and the character says, okay, now I'm going to explain to you why all of this happened, and some idiot has ripped that page out of the book. That'll pull you out of a story. That pulls you out for sure. When I finished reading the book, I think that was, so this is actually going back quite a ways, because I believe Archer had read the book, and I asked him to take a picture of that page for me, because he had the physical copy. I said, can you take a picture of this with your phone and just send me that page? And he did. And so.
And for those listening who don't know who Archer is, Archer Caldwell was the former co-host of the show.
Back in the day.
Yeah.
So let's see.
I'll give you one my wife mentioned too when I mentioned the topic to her, and that's because she's someone, I've mentioned before that some people read different ways, but some people sub-vocalize, where it's really like your brain is reading it out word for word like you would if you were reading it out loud. And so really long, complicated sentence structures can make her hit that reset and have to go back, and every time, if she has to do that too many times, she may put a book down. And in any event, it does break the story for that moment, and something that she's not terribly keen on. But I'm happy to say that she has been, even though some of the Neil Gaiman stuff can get a little creative with sentence structure, she's enjoying it. So
yeah, that's interesting. I remember reading a blog post recently, and I'm sure I bookmarked it, but it was about the types of things that can very easily pull a dyslexic out of a story, and it had to do with things like font choice, alignment. I can't remember if it was that justification is apparently something that can make it more difficult for them to read, or I can't remember which way it went. Justification,
or ragged
good
right.
yeah, good or bad, I can't remember. But there's those types of things to think of as well.
I never thought of that. Yeah, that's interesting.
And we're gonna.
That's a good point. Actually, if I read an ebook with the ragged right, that pulls me out a bit. I don't. My eye really doesn't like that. Because with paper book, you'd be like, what the heck's going on? But compared to like if I'm reading blog posts or if I was reading websites, that would be fine. But if I'm reading an ebook, that bothers me. But I know some people don't like the justification. They don't like how it can stretch out the spaces on a funny shaped screen.
Right.
So they might go the other way with that.
And the other I was going to mention as well, that there is a blog out there that kind of deals with what we've been talking about that I wanted to mention, which is Immerse or Die. And Jamie, you remember
Jefferson Smith is his name.
Okay, where he gets on a treadmill and starts reading, and I think his it's 40 minutes, I think, is his top end, to say if a book can keep him on the treadmill for 40 minutes, it's good.
And he gives you up to 3 strikes, I think.
Yeah, so he'll get to read the book, and then he blogs about, this book lasted 5 minutes before I got pulled out enough times that I got off the treadmill and wrote this post. So that's interesting. And he's got lots of things that'll pull him out. Anything else before we?
Oh, one last one that I remember from a book that I read right early on when I was in the show, and it's something just ridiculous, ridiculously doesn't make sense. So, I had this example where it was a fantasy novel, and someone had been digging trenches all day with a shovel. And he was like a slave. So it's a slave work gang is digging trenches, and the orc overseers are doing something. And then he's finally hit the wall. He can't deal with it anymore, and he takes the shovel and looked into the mirror finish of the blade and the razor sharp edge and started slicing up the orcs with it. And I'm like, okay, if you've got slave issue shovel that you've been working with day after day in hard stone and stuff. First of all, if you've ever used a shovel in your life, it's going to look like crap. You're not going to see your face in this thing, and you're going to be lucky it has, it could cut bread, much less cleave through someone's skull. So, yeah, that really set me off, and I think my wife read that same part and was like, I'm done with this. That and the superpowers kind of abilities that never really got explained. I was hoping they would, but they never did.
Okay. Any last minute comments, Michael, before we wrap it up?
Nope, we're good.
We're good? Okay. So we'd love to hear from you. If you want to get in touch with us, you can send us an email at tbrpodcast@gmail.com, and be sure to visit our Goodreads page where you can keep up with all of the things that we're reading. And if I did my job, it should be in the show description down below. And next week, we're going to be talking about reading outside of your normal genres, and we're going to have a guest author on next week, P.T. Hilton. He's the author of Regulation 19, and he will be joining us for that talk. So we hope to see you there. And have a great week.
Take care, everyone.
Stay warm and happy reading.